Samuel Taylor Coleridge's This Lime Tree Bower, My Prison belongs to a group of poems that are typically referred to as conversation poems, as a very kind of narrow group referring to a number of Coleridge's poems in particular. Um, Essentially, these poems are uh, first of all, addressed to close friends, or in the case of Frost at Midnight, addressed to Coleridge's infant child. But they're not dialogues. They're poems in which the speaker imagines the presence of another person, but does not actually have a conversation with them. So they're still um, like monologues in that sense. These poems are informal but serious reflections that are initiated by the speaker's setting. So this puts them in common with a number of poems we are looking at in this course. Uh, Typically, the conversation poems begin with some kind of feeling of alienation from nature and end with the speaker returning to a sense of unity with nature, which again is a characteristic romantic movement. Uh, Another thing that makes the poems conversational, hence the title, is that they kind of tend to move from what is immediately present to the speaker through a number of related topics and then returning back to the starting point with some kind of change in mood and usually some insight gained. Again, this probably all sounds quite familiar. There's a lot in common here with some of the other poems we've read, especially those of Wordsworth. Um, for one thing, they share this idealization of the seemingly spontaneous, that conversation poems don't feel planned, which isn't to say that Coleridge did not plan the poem out carefully, but it gives this impression of being unplanned. Certainly, this poem in particular is very much comparable to Tintern Abbey in form, and the conversation poems in general do tend to share a number of features with the broader category of the greater romantic lyric. They're serious reflections that start in a particular place and after an imaginative engagement with something outside of them, return back to that point. In particular, the conclusion of the poem, the statement that nature ne'er deserts the wise and pure, very much echoes the end of Tintern Abbey, just as Coleridge's turn towards Charles Lamb as the true votary of nature echoes the way in which Wordsworth kind of passes the torch to Dorothy at the end of Tintern Abbey. Looking particularly at this lime tree bower, my prison, we can see the initial alienation in this case is spatial, that he can't walk with his friends. He explains that this is something that he was anticipating with great joy, but he's unable to walk because his wife dropped a pan of boiling milk on his foot. Literary historians disagree about whether or not this was an accident, by the way. So instead, he's sitting in this lime tree bower. He's thinking about his friends, and in particular, Charles Lamb, one of his closest friends, also a romantic essayist. Coleridge and Lamb were in school together in London. And so Coleridge clearly feels a great affinity for Lamb. The speaker in this poem starts by sulking about the sights he missed, but in doing so, he imaginatively recreates them. And then in the end of the poem, he realizes that he has gained the profit that he expected to get from the walk, but he has gained it in a different way. Conversation poems very often cast nature as a force that rescues people, particularly from the soul destroying forces of the modern or urban world, the city. Um, the There are significant parallels, as I mentioned, between Charles Lamb and Coleridge himself. That they were childhood friends. They both hungered after nature many a year in the great city pent. In the poem, the speaker refers to Lamb in that way, but it's arguably true of both of them. Uh, But by the end of the poem, Coleridge blesses the last rook, crow-like bird, generally considered very unpleasant. So it's symbolic of this compensating power of nature, in that even the rook is blessed, just as the speaker appreciates the sights in his lime tree bower in the end as much as the sights that he would have seen with his friends with his friends on the walk. Uh, Anticipating also that we're going to read the rhyme of the ancient mariner, the blessing of the last rook is also comparable to the mariner's blessing of the slimy water snakes, which is something we will talk about in a few weeks' time. So again, this poem, the genre of the conversation poem shares a great deal the uh, with the romantic genres we've been reading up to this point, and as we can see, it ends with this conclusion, focusing on the power of nature.